Hello, I'm Mbweha. You can call me Ben of Team Relentless, and this is the Scrapyard where you can come to learn how to make something for Star Wars Legion. Today, we'll be making a table. We'll be making the full map for a 800-point game of Star Wars Legion, a tournament-ready table that would be fair and balanced for all types of lists, and fair and balanced in its usage of terrain. This table, in fact, is the table that we will build. So let's get started right away. Alrighty, we're setting up a map today called the Team Relentless Hideout. It is intended to be a balanced map that will have the correct mixture of heavy line of sight blocking terrain, of scattered terrain, and of area terrain. You can see I've got everything squished to one side. I'm showing you how much terrain is on the table. These three range rulers represent 25% of the board. And if you add this one, then that would represent a third of the board. So the idea is it should be, every map should have, if you squish it all to one side, somewhere between 25 and 33%, somewhere between a fourth and a third of the table should be full of terrain before it is spread out appropriately. Of that, that terrain that is now out, which again, just to kind of show you, it's a little bit, closer to 25 over there, closer to a third over here, so it's in between. It's about 30% total. When I measured it earlier more precisely. Of the terrain, to create a balanced table, about a third of the terrain I have is line of sight blocking stuff of various heights. Most of it's tall on this, but I got a little bit of stuff that's short. And then there is scatter terrain, which is scatter terrain. It's not line of sight blocking. There it is, about a third of that. And then about a third of it area terrain, which you can see here. There's you'll see when it's set up, this river will be subdivided into three different area terrain pieces, subdivided by the scatter terrain bridges here. And yeah, that's the right mixture combination to create a fair, balanced table in Star Wars Legion. Let's see what it looks like when we spread the terrain out. Okay, we now have the terrain spread out across the playing area, and as I set it, I was conscious of objectives, of deployments, and of firing lanes. Those are the three things that you really need to keep in mind as you're placing the terrain. The big three. There's lots of things that we're going to talk about that I was thinking about as I placed this. Let's go over the objectives first. There are kind of two key objectives that you need to consider anytime that you're setting up a table. The first is key positions. What is your key position that is mandatory, which is the centermost terrain piece? I've got a small piece of area terrain. There's good things and bad things about that. The thing that a player would have to consider if they were facing something like a Gav or an AAT, something with a big, large base, is that it could come in on the final turn and kind of cover the whole thing. And so an opponent facing such a list would need to make sure that they brought that unit down before the end of the game. So it's not necessarily good or bad, but it's a conscious decision, something that I'm thinking of when I place this here and go, okay, this table has a smaller piece in the center. If I'm setting up for a tournament, I need some other tables that have bigger pieces in the center too for variety. Intercept the transmissions is the other objective that we think about. The intercept points are right here in the center again, and then right here. The key thing to make sure that you have for intercept is that there's some places where people could score and have some cover. You don't ever want to create a situation with intercept the transmissions where a unit could score but be completely out of line of sight. So for example, don't put a skinny building or something like a tall hedge right next to an intercept point. It creates really uninteractive situations between the two players where someone can be scoring for an objective but be completely out of sight. Okay, deployment zones. The main thing that you really need to consider is range 1 on the long edge of each table, and then range 2 on the short edge of each table, and be thinking of that's where most of the deployment zones are. An exception would be hemmed in can be interesting, making sure that you don't create a horrible hemmed in side. So hemmed in on this side, you kind of have this triangle of deployment. That would be okay. And same thing over here, have a triangle of deployment. The deployment zones shouldn't be overcrowded with terrain. They should have a little bit of terrain in them. And you also need to think about making sure that there isn't any terrain piece that is too close to the edge of the board where if someone was playing payload and that piece of terrain was not fully within a zone, that it could become a really unfair payload. So for example, this piece here, if it was right on the edge, like here, and we were playing, I don't know, or actually right here would be really bad for advanced positions, because this is not fully it's a little bit outside of range 1 right here, and so this as a KP would be really unfair. So you gotta kind of keep some things like that in mind. This I haven't necessarily thought about every deployment zone and every piece of terrain for key positions, but it's another thing to consider. I guess earlier I said you really only need to think of 2 objectives, but you do need to think about key positions and the way that that would interact with deployment zones. I also want to talk about the firing lanes. In general, you want to set up diagonal firing lanes on pretty much all Legion tables. That way there's kind of some places to hide as you're approaching, but there's surprising open shots that can be taken too. You can notice that this section here, there's a really open firing lane here, really open firing lane here. There's this section here. But in all of those cases, anywhere where I'm drawing those lines, pretty nearby you could be in cover. So something that's, you know, standing in this water is going to have light cover, which we'll talk about in a bit. So they'd have light cover, and then the only shot they'd have that's really in the open, someone would have to put themselves really right here. And that's why there's some area terrain here. So there's places where it seems like it's wide open, but you should be able to get light cover. Similar situation here, there's a long firing lane, but here you have a barricade, and of course this area terrain. Long firing lane here, but again, a building and area terrain. So there's sections where someone could get caught out in the open, but almost always there's ways to sort of cohere such that you can get around it. So you want to think about your firing lanes. It should be possible for someone to end up getting a shot that's fully in the open, but it shouldn't necessarily be really common. And that's the number 1 advantage of area terrain, because it doesn't obstruct line of sight, meaning it doesn't block line of sight, and it provides some cover. So that's why area terrain is my very favorite type of terrain. Perfect. So we talked about objectives, we talked about deployments, we talked about firing lanes. The other thing that I always think about on every map is a line of sight blockers close to the center of the map. You want to not create a situation where a force user with jump has a really big advantage on something like recover the supplies, where they could grab the box and then instantly, you know, even with burst of speed, be totally gone. That's bad. And you also don't want to create a situation where a force user has no approach. So you need usually at least one pretty big medium to large line of sight blocker near the center, and that's what this piece here is accomplishing. And then this here is sort of accomplishing as well. So the idea is that if someone, if it's important to someone to pick their board edge, they can bid hard enough to do that and then choose to be red player, so they can select their board edge on this table if they thought it was really important to get this line of sight blocker. This one's an okay line of sight blocker for that approach, but it's more in the open as you get to and from it. And that was an intentional decision. So this map is designed intentionally so that this board edge that you're viewing, that's closest to the camera, is meant to be slightly stronger than this board edge here next to where I'm standing. But not, it certainly shouldn't just be, it's not going to create an instantly win or lose situation. All right, lastly, we're going to define the terrain as if we were about to play on it, talking about each piece and what it does. Starting with the area terrain, there are 2 types of area terrain. There's this tall grass, which is meant to be light cover and in the open. Light cover and open movement, so it's not going to restrict anything's movement. These pieces are pretty tall. They're tall enough that they actually give cover to most things. Even in some cases, even though you wouldn't really ever get an angle on a T-47, this is taller than half of the T-47's flight stand and the top of the model, and most of them are at least. So that really won't matter, but just to give you a sense of, even though this might not seem like it's really tall, it gives cover to most things in the game, unless they're very tall. Something like an AT-ST doesn't get cover from it, of course. And then the other piece of, oh, side note about that area terrain. It can be really nice to take area terrain and not just, some of it's just stuck out in the open, but if you kind of attach it to your big, heavy line of sight blockers, it can create really nice situations where, well, let me say it this way. The thing that I hate about some table setups is they put their line of big buildings out and then there's nothing next to them to hide if you come out from behind the building. So you're either, you can't see anything, you're totally hidden, totally out of line of sight, or you're in the open. And that can happen sometimes, and that's fine. Like that can happen over here, that can happen over here, but it shouldn't happen all the time. So there's these options where you can come around this corner and there's light cover. There's a barricade right here. You can come around here, there's a barricade. There's this light cover here, there's light cover here, there's light cover here, or heavy cover there, excuse me. So that's why I've got things touching these buildings. You don't want them to be all by themselves. So that's some of the area terrain has been used like that. The other piece of area terrain is this river. This river is intended to be shallow water. So troopers can go over it, but it's difficult. Ground vehicles can go through it without any problem, as I believe what the rule suggestion is. And then these are to show that it does actually give light cover. It's got these tall reeds growing in it, so it's light cover. These are much smaller grasses than the others. They're probably just going to give their cover to things like basically droidicas and shorter, I would imagine. But you'd have to get down with each model and check it if you were playing on the map. There are some pieces of scatter terrain. The scatter terrain are the crates that are adjacent to a lot of the buildings. Those would be heavy cover, and if they were tall enough to block line of sight, they would, like this one. This is really a line of sight blocker, it's big enough. But anyway, this is sort of halfway in between scatter and a building. It's like it's pretty big, but it's got enough gaps and it's got a slope to it that makes it so it's pretty hard to actually hide completely behind it. So I'd call that more of a scatter piece. The bridges are scatter. The bridges are intended so that if you can go over them, it's not difficult to cross the river for troopers. With my opponent, I would say, that's only if you are able to not, clip over the edge of the railing. Of course, you got to go kind of straight at it. So, oops. So that would actually maybe happen a little less often than you would think. This river is really going to be a big, difficult piece, which is intentional. And then the other scatter are these bushes, which most of the time will probably not actually block line of sight. There's enough little gaps in them. And you could even say, hey, let's consider these scatter pieces to be non-line of sight blocking area terrain effectively. And that's a decision you can make with your opponent. It would make them simpler to use, so anytime something's simpler, I would say, yeah, that sounds great. It is, however, so thick that, I think there's also an argument to be made that you would call that heavy cover. And it's impassable for everything. Nothing can end on it, I would say. It's such a thick piece, and I would say not even something with hover should end, or I guess maybe something with that can fly, like the lat should obviously be able to go over it, or a T-47, but I would say none of the other vehicles should probably go over it. And part of that's just because, like, if you're playing on someone else's table, like they've worked hard on their terrain, you shouldn't crush their terrain with your saber tank. That's mean, that's rude, that's inconsiderate, so don't do that. So you could work that out with your opponent first, of course, is kind of the final say. What I might say is, hey, if it doesn't seem it kind of breaks theme in my mind to say, well, the saber tank can't go on there. Well, the saber tank, it floats. It probably could, if we were thinking of this like cinematically. So maybe you just agree with your opponent that it can be removed and like marked somehow. So you put an extra something right there, a coin or whatever, and move it, and then just replace it when you're done, when the saber tank moves off of it. I think that would be also entirely appropriate. And obviously, if something like the lat was flying over it, its base is really big, you'd have to do the same thing. You'd have to mark it and then replace it. And I think that would be totally fine to do. The last thing to talk about is the large line of sight blockers, which are these buildings. The main thing to make sure that everyone would be aware of on this is their height. These are very intentionally designed. This one is, the whole thing is height 2, so you can't just fly over it unless you have speed or 2 or jump 2, of course. And this is height 1 except for its little like chimney smokestack, so like a speeder bike needs to not pass over that chimney smokestack, but it could pass over the rest of it. It also has a ladder right here that grants expert climber. This one, same thing. The center right here is height 2, so you need to not go straight over it with a speeder, but you can clip the edges sort of. This is the same way. You've got a section that is intentionally designed so that it could be clambered up to or scaled up to or flown over, but this section, that's not the case. Moving from this section to this section or up to here, these would all be difficult moves for troopers. This whole thing is intended to be height 1, which it is. This section here, all of this is taller than height 2, but there is this little platform, this awning that things can be up on as long as they can balance there. And then this, of course, is a big line of sight blocker, but it's just height 1, much shorter. This little hill is intended to, it's very much there so that it's not difficult to move onto this box from this angle. So you can get up here and have a nice little firing position towards this important section of the board potentially. Unless, you know, something is taller than you, like an ATST, then you're gonna end up being open if you do that. So those are the pieces. I think that's defining the terrain on this table. I think this table is pretty, it's intended to be a balanced mixture of terrain, not providing an overt advantage to something like heavy vehicles or troopers or speeders or Jedi, but just being really a balanced map for any list. Big sections that are open for movement, and then a big section that is difficult for movement to give it some spice. The last thing I would mention about this table is thinking about the space in between the big line of sight blockers is always, you know, more than range 1, and that is advisable primarily so that those really big bases can go through. You don't want to create a situation where the buildings are so close that a tank can't go through or an AAT can't go through, because that creates frustrating situations for players. And we're trying to make tables that are fair and balanced and fun and interactive without creating issues for players. So that's the Team Relentless Hideout, the TR Hideout map. Almost everything on it is scratch made by me. The only exception would be, of course, the barricades that come in the core set. And I got some 3D printed crates from Imperial Terrain for this. But everything else you see on this table is made by hand, and you can look up some videos on the channel to see how many of them were made. Things like the area terrain, the big buildings, which are made from cardboard and other detritus, I believe is the word. The scatter bushes, the bridges are actually made of straws. The down escape pod here. If you wear contacts, you recognize that pretty quickly as for what it is. If you don't, it might not look like what it is. But yeah, that's this table. I hope you learned a lot about making fair and balanced maps, and we'll see you next time.